Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. We are truly happy that you are spending your time with us today, because this channel is a learning space where English language practice connects with understanding the real world. And in every episode, Julia and I aim to guide you through important global topics using calm, clear, and well-structured English that helps you build vocabulary, improve listening skills, and feel more confident when you hear English used in international discussions and global news.
Yes, Adam. And today's episode is carefully designed for English learners who want to understand world events without stress or confusion, because our goal is not only to teach language, but also to explain complex topics in a peaceful and educational way, so that listeners can follow along comfortably and enjoy learning English through real and meaningful global issues.
Today's topic is how Trump's Greenland tariffs could reshape U.S.-Europe relations in 2026. And this topic is important because it brings together geography, trade, diplomacy, and international cooperation, which are key ideas often mentioned in the news, but not always explained clearly for learners who are still developing their English listening and comprehension skills.
Many English learners hear words like tariffs, trade relations, Europe, the United States, or Greenland in news reports, but they may not fully understand how these ideas are connected or why they matter. So, in today's episode, we will explore these terms step by step using simple English, clear explanations, and real-world context to help everyone understand the topic with confidence.
This topic matters because trade decisions made by large economies can influence international relationships, economic cooperation, and long-term trust between countries. And when trade policies are connected to a strategic location like Greenland, they can affect not only economics, but also diplomacy and future cooperation between the United States and European partners.
By learning about this topic, listeners are not only practicing English, but also learning how international relations work in a calm and logical way, which helps reduce confusion when reading global news, listening to political discussions, or hearing expert opinions shared in English across international media platforms.
In today's discussion, we will focus on understanding the background, meaning, and possible effects of Greenland-related tariffs in a neutral and educational manner, without promoting opinions or giving advice, because our purpose is to support learning and understanding rather than persuasion or emotional debate.
For English learners, this kind of explanation is very helpful because it shows how cause and effect sentences are used in real-world English, such as how one policy decision can influence relationships between countries over time, while also introducing useful vocabulary related to geography, trade, and diplomacy.
Before we continue, dear listeners, we kindly ask for your support. If you find the English Globe helpful for your English learning journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, because your support encourages us to continue creating long, educational, and learner-friendly podcasts focused on real global topics.
We would also love to hear from you, so please write a comment and tell us where you are listening from today. Are you learning English at home, at work, or while traveling? And what are your thoughts about today's topic on trade and international relations?
Sharing your opinions in simple English is a great way to practice writing and become part of a global learning community, where learners from different countries can exchange ideas respectfully and grow together through language and understanding.
Yes, every comment is important to us, and reading your thoughts helps us understand what kind of topics support your learning best. So thank you for being part of the English Globe. And now let us begin our discussion by exploring the global context and understanding why Greenland matters in today's international relations.
When we use the word tariff in international relations, we are usually talking about a tax that a government puts on goods coming into the country from abroad, and this tax is added to the price of imported products so that they become more expensive for buyers, which means tariffs are often used to influence trade behavior, protect local industries, or signal economic concerns. And for English learners, it is helpful to remember that tariffs are not about stopping trade completely, but about changing how trade works by adjusting prices.
So Adam, if I understand correctly, a tariff is not a rule that bans products, but rather a tool that changes the cost of goods. And this is important for learners to know because many people think tariffs mean trade is ending, when in reality trade is still happening, but it is happening under different conditions. And governments are using tariffs to guide economic decisions while still staying connected to global markets.
Yes, that is exactly right. And to make this clearer, imagine a country is importing cars from another country, and when a tariff is added, the price of those imported cars increases, which means consumers may start buying locally produced cars instead. And this example shows how tariffs work in a very practical way by influencing choices rather than forcing actions, which is why tariffs are often described as economic tools instead of direct commands.
For English learners, this example is very useful because it shows cause and effect clearly, since higher prices are causing changes in buying behavior. And this helps listeners understand how governments are using tariffs to shape markets gradually, rather than making sudden or aggressive moves, which also explains why tariffs are common in international relations and are discussed calmly in policy conversations.
Countries use tariffs in international relations for several reasons, and one important reason is to protect domestic industries that may be struggling to compete with cheaper foreign products, while another reason is to encourage negotiation by applying economic pressure that signals dissatisfaction without using force, and this is why tariffs are often mentioned alongside diplomacy, because they are part of a broader communication process between governments.
This distinction is very important for learners because economic pressure and diplomacy are not the same thing, even though they are connected, since diplomacy focuses on dialogue, negotiation, and agreement through communication, while economic pressure uses tools like tariffs to influence behavior indirectly. And understanding this difference helps listeners follow international news without confusion or misunderstanding.
In simple terms, diplomacy is when countries are talking and negotiating directly to solve problems, while economic pressure is when countries are using financial tools to support their negotiating position. And in many modern situations, governments are using both at the same time, which means they are talking while also adjusting trade policies, and this combined approach is very common in global politics today.
For English learners, it is helpful to notice that when news reports say countries are using tariffs, they are often saying that governments are expressing concerns through economic actions instead of military or aggressive steps. And this language shows that tariffs are usually part of controlled and legal international systems, rather than signs of conflict or instability.
When we connect this understanding to global trade in 2026, we can see that tariffs are still being used carefully because countries are deeply connected through supply chains, technology, and shared markets, which means governments are constantly balancing protection of national interests with the need for cooperation. And tariffs are one of the tools being used to manage this balance in a structured and predictable way.
So, as listeners continue learning English through this episode, they should remember that tariffs are not emotional reactions, but calculated economic tools. And by understanding how they work, learners can listen to global discussions with more confidence, recognize formal policy language more easily, and improve their ability to follow complex topics using clear and simple English structures.
Dear listeners, today we will explain the policy known as Trump's Greenland-related tariffs in 2026, and this policy can be understood as a decision in which certain goods imported from Europe, particularly those connected to Greenland's strategic interests, are being subjected to additional taxes or tariffs by the United States government, and the purpose of this policy, according to official statements, is to encourage discussion on trade, strengthen negotiation positions, and ensure that strategic economic and geographic concerns are being addressed in a structured and careful manner without using force or aggression.
Adam, could you help learners understand what it means when a tariff policy is related to strategic interests? For example, Does this mean Greenland itself is being taxed, or the goods coming from certain regions?
That is an excellent question, Julia. In simple terms, the policy does not apply to Greenland as a territory, but rather to goods, trade, and services that are connected to Greenland's geographic and strategic importance, such as shipping routes, resources, and industrial products, and in news-style English. This is often described in the passive voice, for example, when it is said that tariffs are applied to imports related to Greenland, which emphasizes the action and the policy itself rather than focusing on individuals or emotions, helping learners see how formal policy language is structured.
So, listeners, the key point is that the United States is using a legal economic tool called a tariff to influence international discussions, and this is different from a military action or a sudden decision, because the tariffs are applied systematically and according to laws, which is why the passive voice is often used in reports, such as, the tariffs are announced by the government, or the goods are subjected to additional taxes, which focuses on the process instead of opinions or controversy.
Exactly, Julia. And to give a clear example, suppose certain imported minerals, metals, or industrial products that pass through Greenland's logistical channels are affected by these tariffs, then their prices are adjusted, and businesses, both in the United States and in Europe, are informed through official trade notices that these tariffs are in effect, which allows companies and governments to plan accordingly. And this structured application demonstrates how policy is communicated in neutral, predictable terms to avoid misunderstanding and maintain stable international relations.
For English learners, this example shows that policies are often described in long sentences, but each part of the sentence can be understood step by step. The goods are imported, the tariffs are applied, companies are notified, and negotiations or discussions are encouraged. By breaking down the sentence in this way, learners can improve comprehension while listening to real-world English used in policy and news discussions.
Another important point is that tariffs in this context are closely connected to strategic interests, which means that countries are thinking about long-term access to resources, trade routes, and partnerships when they apply these economic measures, and the policy language often highlights phrases like strategic importance, negotiation leverage, or economic influence, all of which are used to describe the reasoning behind the tariffs in neutral and professional news-style English without implying judgment, bias, or emotional reaction.
Listeners should notice that words like strategic, leverage, and influence appear frequently in international news, and understanding them helps learners follow articles or reports about trade policies, because these words often describe actions and consequences in a calm, factual way, rather than showing opinions or taking sides, which is essential for learning English in a safe and structured environment.
It is also helpful to understand that policy announcements, such as Trump's Greenland-related tariffs, are usually accompanied by explanations from government agencies, where they are described as temporary, adjustable, or subject to negotiation, which emphasizes that these tariffs are part of a broader strategy of economic signaling. And in news-style English, this is frequently expressed in passive constructions like, the tariffs are introduced to encourage discussion, or adjustments are considered based on international feedback, helping learners recognize professional phrasing.
Yes, Adam, and for learners, it is important to note that this kind of language can appear long, but it follows a logical structure. First, the action is introduced, then the reason is given, and finally, the effect is explained, which makes it easier to understand if listeners focus on each segment, instead of trying to interpret the entire sentence at once, which is a useful technique for improving listening comprehension at an advanced beginner or intermediate level.
In 2026, these tariffs are being applied while global trade networks remain highly interconnected, which means that any policy affecting Greenland-related imports will also be observed by European governments, multinational corporations, and international organizations, and the policy is carefully framed to show that the United States is using standard legal and economic channels to express its position, rather than making sudden or aggressive moves, which is why formal, neutral, and precise language is preferred in reporting.
Listeners should remember that words like applied, observed, and framed in this context are passive verbs that help shift the focus from individuals to actions and processes, which is common in news-style English. And understanding this pattern is useful for learners who want to follow news reports, government statements, or policy discussions in a calm, professional, and educational way.
Another aspect is that these tariffs are designed to connect trade policy with discussions about long-term cooperation and negotiation, which means that governments are signaling priorities, raising points for discussion, and providing an incentive for dialogue without creating conflict. And for English learners, noticing the repeated structure of action plus purpose plus effect is very helpful in understanding formal English used in international relations.
For example, a learner might hear a sentence like, "Tariffs are imposed to encourage negotiation and ensure compliance with strategic interests." And by breaking it down, listeners can see, first, the tariffs are imposed, action; second, to encourage negotiation, purpose; third, and ensure compliance with strategic interests, effect, which is a simple but powerful pattern that helps learners improve comprehension and follow professional news-style English.
It is also important to recognize that while these tariffs may affect specific products or economic sectors, the language used in official statements emphasizes neutrality, legality, and process, which means that reports will often use phrases like "are being applied," "are being considered," and "are under review," all of which help learners understand that the policy is deliberate, structured, and designed to support negotiation rather than sudden confrontation.
Yes, and for listeners, paying attention to these passive constructions is very useful because it teaches how formal English often avoids naming individuals or expressing personal opinions, and instead focuses on actions, processes, and outcomes, which is exactly what you will hear in global news about trade, diplomacy, and strategic economic decisions.
Finally, understanding Trump's Greenland-related tariffs also means recognizing that policy decisions are communicated carefully to domestic and international audiences, and news reports emphasize clarity, neutrality, and factual explanation, using repeated professional vocabulary, structured sentences, and passive voice to ensure that learners and general audiences can understand the situation without confusion, while also improving their English comprehension and exposure to policy-related expressions.
So, dear listeners, when you hear about tariffs in news reports, try to notice the patterns, the repeated vocabulary, and the logical sentence structures, because understanding these elements will help you follow complex discussions in English more easily, recognize cause and effect relationships, and build confidence in listening to real-world policy language in a calm and structured way, which is exactly what we aim to teach in the English Globe.
When we examine Europe's economic and political position in relation to Greenland and Arctic security, it is important to understand that European countries have multiple interests that are interconnected, because Greenland is not only a large landmass with significant natural resources, but also a gateway to the Arctic, which has become increasingly important for trade, shipping routes, and security considerations, and compared with other regions, Europe views Arctic stability as critical for both economic growth and maintaining long-standing diplomatic relationships with global partners, including the United States, which makes European responses carefully measured, strategic, and grounded in policy reasoning rather than emotional reaction.
So, Adam, for English learners, this means that Europe is paying attention to Greenland not only because of its resources, but also because it affects security and trade. And compared to other regions, the Arctic has unique importance, which is why countries like Denmark, Norway, and Germany are closely monitoring developments, and they are trying to balance national economic goals with broader regional stability in a calm and thoughtful way that can be explained clearly in English learning contexts.
Exactly, Julia. And one way to see Europe's approach is by examining trade relationships between the United States and European countries, because Europe has strong economic ties with the U.S. that include imports, exports, investment flows, and cooperation in advanced technologies. And when these trade links are compared to other partnerships, such as those with Asia or South America, it is evident that Europe carefully considers how any tariffs or trade adjustments affecting Greenland could influence both immediate economic outcomes and long-term strategic interests, making policy decisions highly calculated and neutral in presentation.
Listeners should notice that when we use comparison structures like compared to other regions, or when these links are compared to others, it helps English learners understand relationships and differences between economic partnerships, and this is a common technique in New-Style English, where the aim is to explain complex geopolitical dynamics in a clear and logical sequence that is still accessible to learners who are developing their vocabulary and comprehension skills.
Another key point is that European countries often respond to U.S. policies by considering a range of diplomatic and economic options, such as negotiating agreements, proposing adjustments in trade terms, or coordinating responses through multinational organizations. And when these actions are compared with unilateral responses, it becomes clear that Europe tends to prioritize collaboration and multilateral solutions to ensure that economic interests, political stability, and security concerns are all addressed simultaneously in a balanced and neutral way.
For English learners, this demonstrates that Europe's approach is often slower and more methodical compared to the United States' sometimes more direct strategies. And by comparing these approaches, listeners can see the difference in tone and policy language, which also helps improve understanding of advanced English structures, cause and effect reasoning, and vocabulary related to economics, diplomacy, and international relations.
Europe also emphasizes Arctic security because the region is strategically important for future trade routes and resource management, and when these security measures are compared to policies in other remote or resource-rich areas, such as Southeast Asia or Africa, it is clear that Europe applies a combination of economic incentives, environmental protection strategies, and diplomatic coordination to ensure that the Arctic remains stable, which is vital for both European and global economic planning, while also demonstrating a long-term commitment to neutral and rule-based international engagement.
Listeners, for learners, this means that words like emphasizes, strategically important, and coordination often appear in policy discussions, and noticing how Europe compares different regions, balances trade and security, and makes decisions without dramatic or emotional language is useful for understanding how professional English is used in international reporting, particularly when discussing economic and political topics.
It is also useful to recognize that European countries evaluate potential impacts of tariffs or trade adjustments on Greenland very carefully, because changes in import costs, resource access, and investment flows could have ripple effects throughout European markets, and when these impacts are compared with domestic economic policies within each country, it becomes evident that European decision-makers are aiming to minimize disruption, maintain economic stability, and coordinate responses through multilateral frameworks, which highlights a structured, measured approach that is repeated in official statements and news reports.
Yes, Adam, and for learners, paying attention to these comparison phrases, like compared with domestic policies, or when these impacts are compared with others, helps understand how journalists and policymakers organize complex information in long, informative sentences, which improves comprehension of professional English, and it also supports vocabulary development in economic, political, and strategic contexts.
Another important aspect is that Europe's response options are diverse and often neutral, including negotiation, consultation, or joint statements in international forums, and when these options are compared with unilateral measures, it is clear that European countries prioritize dialogue, transparency, and predictability, which ensures that any reaction to U.S. policies such as Greenland-related tariffs, is communicated in a way that avoids conflict, supports trade continuity, and maintains strong diplomatic relationships, demonstrating a consistent and calm approach to global economic governance.
For English learners, noticing that words like diverse, dialogue, transparency, and predictability are repeated in news coverage helps with comprehension and retention. And it also shows how professional reporting emphasizes careful and neutral communication, while describing international economic and political strategies, which is exactly what we aim to teach through the English Globe podcasts.
Finally, understanding Europe's economic and political position means seeing how decisions about Greenland, Arctic security, and trade relationships are interconnected, because economic stability, access to strategic resources, and coordination with allies are all part of a broader framework. And when these factors are compared to potential risks, such as supply chain disruption or diplomatic tension, it becomes clear that Europe's approach is methodical, carefully considered, and expressed using neutral, structured, and professional English that learners can follow, analyze, and practice.
Dear listeners, as you follow this discussion, try to notice the comparison structures and economic vocabulary, because understanding phrases like compared to, when these links are compared, and relative to other regions, is very helpful in professional English. And by listening to how Europe balances economic interests, security concerns, and diplomatic engagement, you are improving your ability to understand international news in English, strengthen your comprehension of long sentences, and expand your vocabulary in real-world contexts.
Dear listeners, when we examine the Arctic region in 2026, it is increasingly clear that this area is becoming a central focus of global attention, because melting ice, changing climate conditions, and advances in technology are creating new opportunities for shipping lanes, resource exploration, and international trade. And as these trends continue, countries around the world, including the United States, Europe, and Asian powers, are planning long-term strategies to ensure access, maintain security, and participate in economic development, which makes the Arctic not just a remote and icy region, but a key area for understanding global competition and the ways nations interact in future decades.
Adam, so for English learners, this means that the Arctic is becoming important, not only for environmental reasons, but also because new trade routes are opening and resources are more accessible. And this will influence how countries plan for the future, which is why words like trend, opportunity, and strategy are useful vocabulary to understand when reading or listening to international news in English, especially in discussions about geography and global economics.
Another factor that explains the Arctic's growing importance is security, because countries are paying close attention to territorial claims, military presence, and international agreements. And as competition increases over strategic access points and natural resources, governments are investing in surveillance, infrastructure, and international diplomacy. And when these efforts are examined over time, they show clear patterns in which the Arctic is no longer peripheral, but central to long-term planning, cooperation, and sometimes cautious competition, which can be described in English using phrases like is expected to, is predicted to, and is likely to influence, which learners can practice to understand future-focused reporting.
Listeners for learners, this means that words like expected, predicted, and likely help describe trends without suggesting certainty. And when news reports say that the Arctic is expected to see increased shipping activity, it is a neutral and educational way to explain future developments, which is useful for understanding how journalists and policy analysts describe ongoing changes in strategic regions like Greenland and the wider Arctic area.
In addition to security, shipping lanes are a major reason for the Arctic's rising prominence, because as ice melts and global trade demands grow, new routes are becoming shorter alternatives to traditional passages. And when these routes are compared to established shipping lanes, such as the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, they are predicted to save time and reduce fuel costs, which has economic implications for both exporters and importers, and governments are creating policies to regulate and protect these lanes, while also ensuring that international law and environmental standards are respected, which demonstrates the complex but structured nature of Arctic competition in factual, educational terms.
For English learners, this example connects an abstract idea, like global shipping trends, to everyday understanding, because shorter shipping routes mean faster deliveries, lower costs, and more efficient trade, which can be compared to taking a shortcut while driving or using a faster path in logistics, helping listeners understand how Arctic changes will impact real-world economic activities while improving English comprehension.
Global competition in the Arctic also involves resource exploration, because minerals, rare earth elements, and potential energy reserves are becoming more accessible due to technological advances and environmental changes. And as these resources are predicted to be in higher demand in the coming years, countries are planning strategic investments, cooperative agreements, and regulatory frameworks to ensure that resource extraction is managed responsibly, which highlights how economic, environmental, and security priorities intersect in long-term planning. And this can be expressed in English using future-oriented phrases like will likely, is projected to, and is anticipated.
Listeners. For learners, this demonstrates how future-focused language works in practice, because phrases like will likely increase or is projected to affect allow journalists, policy analysts, and educators to explain developments in a neutral and educational way, which is exactly how we can describe Arctic trends without expressing opinions or using emotional language while still conveying important global information.
It is also important to note that Arctic security and global competition are closely connected because countries are expected to invest in technology, communications, and surveillance systems to monitor both natural conditions and human activities, and these investments are predicted to influence trade routes, regional stability, and international partnerships, which means that strategic vocabulary, such as monitoring, investment, regional stability, and partnerships, becomes very useful for English learners to understand the language of international relations and long-term planning in a clear and neutral format.
For example, when a sentence says, infrastructure is being developed to monitor new shipping routes, learners can see that passive voice is used to focus on actions rather than individuals, and by identifying key words like monitor, develop, and routes, English learners can expand their vocabulary while following complex ideas in professional news-style English.
Another trend to notice is that Arctic developments are increasingly influenced by multilateral cooperation because countries are forming agreements on environmental protection, shipping regulations, and resource management, and these agreements are expected to reduce conflicts, provide clarity in international law, and encourage sustainable development, which shows how long-term trends and strategic thinking shape Arctic policy. And when these sentences are expressed using future-focused verbs and passive constructions, learners are exposed to a style of English that is very common in formal reporting and policy discussions.
Listeners should notice that terms like multilateral, sustainable development, and international law are often repeated in news coverage and policy statements, and understanding these words in context helps learners connect abstract concepts to everyday reasoning, such as thinking about rules, cooperation, and responsibility in situations like community projects, environmental planning, or trade negotiations, which makes the content more relatable and easier to follow.
Finally, by understanding the Arctic in 2026, including trends in security, shipping, and global competition, listeners can see that strategic regions are shaped by predictable long-term patterns, such as melting ice opening new routes, countries investing in infrastructure, and resources becoming more accessible. And when these trends are analyzed in structured, future-focused English, learners are able to follow complex global developments calmly, expand vocabulary, and develop the ability to understand international news without confusion or bias.
As you continue listening, try to focus on the future-focused language, trend phrases and prediction terms we have used in this discussion, because recognizing patterns like is expected to increase, will likely influence, and is projected to affect, will help you follow professional English in global news, understand abstract ideas, and connect concepts like trade, security, and resources to everyday examples, which is exactly the kind of skill we are developing together on the English globe.
Dear listeners, when we analyze the impact of Greenland-related tariffs on U.S.-Europe relations in 2026, it is important to understand that trade policies, such as tariffs, can influence both economic cooperation and diplomatic trust. Because when one country applies tariffs to imports connected to a strategic region, other countries may carefully evaluate how these measures affect ongoing partnerships, and in international reporting, this is often described using neutral and formal language, such as relations are being reassessed or negotiations are being initiated to address concerns, which allows journalists and policy analysts to explain potential consequences without expressing opinion or judgment.
So, Adam, for English learners, this means that tariffs are more than just economic tools. They can also influence how countries work together, and words like cooperation, trust, and partnerships appear often in news coverage to explain the effect of economic decisions on diplomatic relationships, which is why understanding these words and phrases is essential for following global discussions in clear English.
Exactly, Julia. And it is useful to note that trade relationships and alliance relationships are related but not identical, because countries may continue to maintain strong military or political alliances even when economic measures like tariffs create temporary tension, and this distinction is frequently emphasized in professional reports using neutral structures. For example, trade cooperation is being adjusted while security agreements are maintained, which helps English learners see how complex relationships are explained in structured and balanced language.
For learners, the key point is that countries can disagree on trade matters without ending diplomatic alliances, and sentences such as security agreements are maintained or diplomatic channels remain open show how formal English communicates ongoing collaboration despite economic differences, making it easier to follow nuanced international news without confusion or emotional language.
In addition, the application of Greenland-related tariffs has led analysts to discuss potential consequences for multilateral negotiations, because when tariffs are applied to goods connected to strategic areas, European countries may reassess their positions in joint trade agreements, budget contributions, and coordination within international organizations, and this is often expressed in professional English using phrases like policies are under review or negotiations are being conducted to ensure alignment, which allows learners to understand cause and effect relationships in a diplomatic context.
Listeners, this means that even though tariffs affect economic interactions, formal news and policy language often focus on solutions, adjustments, and communication, rather than blame, and by recognizing phrases like under review or being conducted to ensure alignment, English learners can improve comprehension of how neutral and professional English is used to describe international relations.
Another important aspect is that diplomatic language often uses the passive voice and neutral expressions to describe actions without assigning personal responsibility. For example, discussions are being held to address trade concerns, or agreements are being adjusted to reflect current economic conditions, and in these cases, the focus is placed on processes and outcomes rather than individuals, which is a hallmark of formal international English, and is particularly useful for learners who are practicing comprehension of professional news-style sentences.
For learners, understanding that the passive voice shifts attention from who is doing the action to what is happening is very helpful. Because in international news, you often hear about policies, agreements, and discussions rather than about politicians' emotions or personal intentions, which makes it easier to follow the facts and understand the consequences of decisions like Greenland-related tariffs.
It is also useful to note that tariffs can influence trust between nations, because economic measures send signals about priorities, negotiation strategies, and long-term intentions. And while trade disagreements may create caution or concern, diplomats use formal language to emphasize continuity, dialogue, and collaboration, which is frequently reported with sentences such as, confidence is being maintained through ongoing consultation, or cooperation is being reinforced despite economic adjustments. And these expressions allow learners to see how professional English balances explanation with neutrality.
Listeners, this means that when news reports use phrases like confidence is being maintained or cooperation is being reinforced, the language is designed to reassure readers and listeners that relationships continue despite challenges, and by repeating these neutral expressions, learners can practice comprehension and notice how diplomatic English communicates subtle ideas without emotional language.
Another effect of the Greenland Tariffs is the emphasis on long-term alignment, because European countries may adjust their trade strategies while ensuring that military alliances, joint research programs, and shared security initiatives remain intact, and this is often described using neutral phrases like policies are being harmonized, agreements are being coordinated, or relations are being maintained, which demonstrates how formal English in international reporting focuses on continuity, structure, and predictable outcomes, rather than speculation or personal opinion.
For English learners, recognizing phrases like being harmonized, being coordinated, and being maintained is useful, because they show how professional news describes ongoing action in neutral terms, which helps listeners understand the balance between trade measures and diplomatic stability. And it also reinforces vocabulary that is often repeated in articles and broadcasts about international relations.
In addition, analysts emphasize that economic disagreements caused by tariffs can lead to careful adjustments in negotiation strategy, because countries may use consultation, dialogue, and joint problem-solving to prevent minor trade issues from escalating into larger conflicts, and in English, this is frequently expressed using neutral structures like negotiations are being initiated or measures are being implemented to maintain alignment, which helps learners follow professional reporting while noticing how long, structured sentences convey complex ideas clearly.
Listeners, this shows that diplomatic English often focuses on solutions and procedures, rather than opinions or arguments, and by paying attention to phrases like being implemented to maintain alignment, learners can see how international reports describe action and consequence in a calm, structured, and educational way, which is exactly the goal of our podcast on the English Globe.
Finally, understanding the impact of Greenland-related tariffs on U.S.-Europe relations requires seeing both short-term economic effects and long-term diplomatic patterns, because countries balance trade, alliance commitments, and global influence carefully. And when these relationships are described in professional English, we often encounter sentences such as, cooperation is being preserved while trade concerns are addressed, or relations are being monitored to ensure mutual benefit, which illustrate neutral, fact-based, and structured communication suitable for English learners to follow and practice.
Dear listeners, as you continue learning through this section, try to notice how neutral opinion structures, passive voice, and diplomatic vocabulary allow complex international interactions to be described in calm and educational English. And by understanding phrases like being preserved, are being monitored, and while concerns are addressed, learners can improve both comprehension and professional vocabulary in a real-world context, which is a key part of practicing English through global news topics.
When we analyze the economic consequences of Greenland-related tariffs on global markets, it is important to understand that tariffs are not only a tool for policy signaling, but also a mechanism that can influence prices, supply chains, and company decisions across multiple regions. Because when a tariff is applied to imported goods connected to a strategic area like Greenland, the cost of these goods often rises, and companies that rely on imports or exports adjust production, sourcing, or pricing strategies accordingly, which in turn affects consumers, international trade flows, and even investor expectations in a calm, predictable, and measurable manner.
Adam, for English learners. This means that tariffs can make imported goods more expensive, and this change affects companies that sell these goods as well as the people who buy them. And the idea of cause and effect is very important here, because higher costs for imported materials often lead to price adjustments for final products, which is why economic vocabulary like supply chain, pricing strategy, and investor expectations is useful to understand professional reporting on trade.
Another key point is that global trade connections are complex because countries are linked through supply chains, shipping networks, and financial agreements. And when tariffs affect one region, like Greenland-related imports, ripple effects can be observed in multiple sectors, such as raw materials, energy, manufacturing, and consumer goods. And in professional English, this is often described using phrases like, economic impact is being transmitted through international networks, or supply adjustments are being implemented to reflect new costs, which allows learners to follow structured explanations of complex global interactions.
Listeners, for learners, this shows that a single economic measure, like a tariff, can affect many businesses and products worldwide. And by noticing words like ripple effects, transmitted, and implemented, learners can connect the language to real-world examples, such as a rise in the price of electronics, clothing, or energy when imported materials become more expensive, making complex economic concepts easier to understand in English.
It is also useful to understand that companies often respond to tariffs by evaluating alternative suppliers, adjusting production schedules, or negotiating new contracts. And these decisions can influence both short-term profitability and long-term investment plans, which in turn affects international markets. And in professional news-style English, such cause and effect relationships are expressed with neutral language, using phrases like, adjustments are being made to mitigate cost increases, or companies are revising sourcing strategies in response to tariffs, which learners can follow while improving comprehension of formal economic reporting.
For English learners, this example highlights the connection between actions and consequences, because if a company changes suppliers or production, it directly affects product availability, pricing, and trade patterns. And by repeating and summarizing these phrases, learners can internalize how professional English communicates cause and effect in global economics without fear-based or dramatic framing.
Another important factor is the effect on consumers, because when tariffs increase the cost of imported goods, companies may pass part or all of these costs onto buyers, which can influence purchasing behavior, demand for certain products, and even perceptions of market stability. And this chain reaction demonstrates how interconnected global economies are, and in news reporting, these effects are often described using neutral sentences such as, prices are being adjusted in response to tariffs, or consumer demand is being monitored to assess market trends, which provides clear and structured language for learners.
Listeners, this means that when news reports say prices are being adjusted, it is not about panic or crisis. It is simply explaining the logical sequence of events. And learners can see that economic decisions follow predictable patterns, which helps them understand professional English when reading or listening to reports on trade, markets, or corporate strategy.
It is also worth noting that global investors and financial markets closely watch tariff announcements, because the potential impact on production costs, profit margins, and international trade flows can influence stock valuations, bond yields, and corporate investment decisions. And in neutral, professional English, this is often expressed with phrases such as, market responses are being observed, or investors are adjusting expectations based on new trade policies, which demonstrates cause and effect in a way that learners can follow while increasing vocabulary related to finance and international business.
For learners, The key point is that words like market responses, adjusting expectations, and trade policies describe neutral, fact-based reactions. And by focusing on these phrases, listeners can understand how economic news explains changes in markets, investments, and consumer behavior without using fear-based language, which is essential for educational podcasts.
Another consequence of Greenland-related tariffs is that multinational companies may reevaluate their global supply chains to optimize efficiency, reduce exposure to tariff-affected imports, or explore new partnerships. And when these adjustments are compared to typical operational changes, it becomes clear that companies are acting strategically to maintain profitability, ensure product availability, and adapt to long-term trade trends, which in professional English is described using neutral and structured language such as supply chains are being evaluated, or operational adjustments are being implemented to ensure continuity, helping learners see how complex ideas are communicated clearly.
Listeners, this means that companies are planning ahead, just like someone who changes their route to avoid traffic or finds alternative suppliers when prices rise, and phrases like evaluated and implemented help learners recognize formal English patterns used in international business reporting, making the content easier to understand and repeat.
It is also important to recognize that tariffs can influence global trade balances, because when imports become more expensive, trade flows may shift to other countries or regions, and exports may be adjusted to maintain competitiveness, which is frequently described in professional news reports with neutral phrases like trade patterns are being monitored, or economic adjustments are being considered to maintain equilibrium, showing learners how cause and effect chains are communicated in formal English without dramatic language.
Yes, Adam, and for learners, noticing that phrases like maintain equilibrium or being monitored describe observation and adjustment rather than conflict is key, because it shows that global markets are dynamic but manageable, and that English used in professional reporting emphasizes neutral cause and effect relationships, which is exactly the kind of comprehension skill we are developing on the English globe.
Finally, understanding the economic consequences of Greenland-related tariffs involves seeing the chain of effects from policy decisions to companies, consumers, and global trade networks, because tariffs influence prices, production, supply chains, and investor expectations in predictable ways. And when these dynamics are described in long, structured, neutral sentences using economic vocabulary, learners are able to improve comprehension, recognize patterns, and apply these skills to real-world news, business discussions, and professional English contexts in a calm and educational manner.
Dear listeners, as you continue practicing English through this discussion, focus on cause and effect phrases like prices are being adjusted, supply chains are being evaluated, and economic adjustments are being considered, because understanding these phrases allows learners to follow professional reports on global trade, business strategy, and policy impact, all in a neutral, educational, and structured way, which is the primary goal of our podcast on the English globe.
All right, in this section, we are going to explore how media coverage shapes our understanding of international policies, such as the recent tariffs related to Greenland, and how this, in turn, can influence public perception, political debate, and even diplomatic relations, while keeping in mind that news reporting often simplifies complex issues to grab attention, which is why it is very important for learners of English to develop the skills to read between the lines, identify key vocabulary, and recognize the difference between a headline and the full story, because often a headline might suggest conflict or drama, while the article itself may explain the situation in a calm and factual way, and understanding this distinction helps listeners avoid misunderstanding the actual policy or its consequences.
Yes, Adam, this is very important for English learners, because the way news is written can sometimes be confusing, especially if the sentences are long or use unfamiliar words. So one tip is to focus on keywords like tariff, trade, policy, impact, or agreement, and then try to understand how these words connect in the sentence to explain cause and effect. For example, when a news article says, "The new US tariffs on Greenland exports could alter European supply chains," you can break it down by understanding that tariffs means extra taxes, alter means change, and supply chains refers to how goods move from one country to another, which allows you to understand the main point without being distracted by complicated grammar or extra details.
Exactly, Julia. Another aspect to consider is the language style used in media reports, because newspapers, television, and online platforms often have different priorities. Some focus on speed, giving breaking headlines that summarize events in one line, while others focus on detailed analysis, explaining the historical, economic, and geopolitical context behind a policy. And for English learners, this is an excellent opportunity to practice comprehension at multiple levels, because you can first read or listen to the headline to get a general idea, then look at the full article or report to understand the nuances. And finally, notice how experts or journalists use specific words repeatedly, which helps learners build vocabulary and context, such as terms like bilateral relations, economic leverage, strategic interests, or diplomatic channels, all of which are common when discussing international tariffs or Arctic policies.
And, Adam, another useful strategy is to pay attention to the verbs and sentence structures that media use to indicate certainty or possibility. For example, words like may affect, could change, is expected to, or analysts suggest. These phrases are very common in international news and help the reader or listener understand that the situation is ongoing and outcomes are not guaranteed, which is very important when learning English because these modal verbs and expressions show how native speakers express uncertainty, caution, or prediction. And practicing these in context will also improve your listening comprehension, especially when you watch news videos or listen to podcasts that discuss complex topics like US-Europe relations.
That's right, Julia. Another challenge for English learners is that media reports often use idiomatic expressions or phrases that are not always literal, such as trade tensions are heating up or Greenland is under the spotlight. And if you take these phrases literally, you might misunderstand the meaning. So it is helpful to always try to connect these expressions with the context of the article. Because heating up does not mean temperature, it means conflict or tension is increasing, and under the spotlight does not mean light is shining on Greenland, but that the country or topic is receiving attention in political and economic discussions, and noticing these common idioms in media will help learners gradually understand more natural English in real-world situations.
Yes, and when reading or listening to news about tariffs, another useful technique is to summarize each paragraph or segment in your own words, because this forces you to identify the main idea, key vocabulary, and the connections between sentences. For example, if a news report says, European leaders are evaluating the potential impact of US Greenland tariffs on their Arctic operations, with some analysts warning that a prolonged trade disagreement could weaken cooperation in scientific research. You can summarize this by saying, Europe is worried that US tariffs may make working together in the Arctic harder. And this exercise helps learners practice simplifying complex English into manageable sentences while retaining the meaning, which is a very practical skill for improving both reading and listening comprehension.
Absolutely. Another element to consider is the role of social media in shaping public understanding, because platforms like Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube often present very short snippets or opinions that are not fully explained. And while these can be helpful for quick updates, they can also create misunderstandings if the audience only reads the headline or a short comment. So learners should try to verify information by checking multiple sources, looking at full articles, or listening to detailed reports, and also pay attention to formal versus informal language, because social media may use slang or casual expressions that differ from professional news reporting, which gives learners another opportunity to expand their vocabulary and understand different registers of English.
Yes, Adam. And one final tip for English learners is to practice active listening when watching news videos or podcasts, meaning you should pause after a sentence or segment, repeat what you heard in your own words, and note down any new vocabulary or expressions, because this helps your brain connect sounds with meaning, which is especially important for topics like US-Europe relations, tariffs, and Arctic strategy, where the vocabulary can be specialized and sentences are often long. So by breaking them into smaller parts and practicing regularly, learners can gradually understand more complex English and feel more confident discussing global issues in English.
In summary, the media is a powerful tool that can help English learners improve comprehension, expand vocabulary, and understand international events. But it requires careful attention, critical thinking, and active practice, because headlines may be dramatic, social media may be opinionated, and even traditional news reports may use formal or idiomatic language. So by identifying key vocabulary, understanding sentence structures, summarizing content, and practicing active listening, learners can become more confident in reading, listening, and discussing world events in English, while also becoming more aware of the difference between public perception and the factual policy details behind international tariffs, such as those affecting Greenland.
Yes, Adam, and remember, learners should approach news in English like a learning opportunity, noticing new words, expressions, sentence patterns, and even cultural references, while always keeping in mind that media coverage is not always complete and may reflect different perspectives. So by combining careful reading, active listening, summarization, and vocabulary building, you can not only understand more about US-Europe relations and Arctic policies, but also strengthen your English skills for future learning, conversations, and even professional use.
And with that, we have covered the important connection between media, messaging, and public understanding, showing how English learners can use international news as a tool for language development while staying informed about policies like Greenland tariffs without confusion or misinformation. All right, in this section, we are going to talk about what the future might look like when it comes to US-Europe relations, Greenland, and the Arctic. But it is important to remember that we are not predicting exactly what will happen, because in international relations, there are always many possible outcomes, and instead, we want to explain the tools, options, and language that leaders might use when negotiating trade, security, and strategic issues, so learners can understand not only the vocabulary, but also the ways governments communicate in a professional and diplomatic manner. For example, words like dialogue, negotiation, cooperation, and multilateral agreements are common when discussing future international relations. And noticing these words helps learners understand discussions about potential solutions, challenges, and agreements without assuming one outcome is guaranteed.
Yes, Adam, and for English learners, it is very useful to pay attention to modal verbs, because these words show possibility, probability, or advice, which is exactly what we need when talking about the future. So we often hear sentences like, the US and Europe could reach an agreement on tariffs, or Greenland might play a bigger role in Arctic security, or trade relations may improve if countries cooperate. And all of these words, could, might, may, help the listener understand that the future is not fixed. And they also help learners practice expressing uncertainty and politeness in English, which is very common in professional and diplomatic communication.
Exactly, Julia. Another key idea is that future international cooperation often depends on trust, communication, and shared goals. So even though tariffs or disagreements may create tension in the short term, countries have tools to manage these situations such as dialogue, joint research projects, strategic partnerships, or multilateral organizations, and learners should notice how sentences describing these tools often use conditional structures such as, if countries continue to communicate, they may reduce tension, or trade agreements could help stabilize economic relations, which are very useful patterns for expressing cause and effect in English, especially when discussing complex topics like global strategy, economics, or security.
And Adam, learners should also notice that the media often uses future-focused language to describe what might happen, which is why it is helpful to compare different sources, because one article may say, "Experts warn that trade disputes may escalate," while another says, "Diplomatic channels could help resolve disagreements." And by understanding these subtle differences, learners can better grasp the meaning and tone of sentences, as well as practice reading and listening comprehension, because modal verbs and future expressions are key to understanding news, analysis, and expert commentary. And they also show how English speakers communicate possibilities, risks, and opportunities in a professional way without giving definite predictions.
Another important point is that learners should focus on vocabulary related to cooperation and negotiation. Because even when discussing potential conflicts, professionals often frame discussions around solutions, not drama, for example. Words like dialogue, mediation, consensus, collaboration, and strategic planning appear often in news about international relations, and these words help learners not only understand the news but also discuss similar topics in their own English conversations or writing. So it is important to notice how these words are used in long sentences that explain relationships, agreements, or challenges, because breaking down these sentences will improve both comprehension and vocabulary retention.
Yes, Adam, and learners should also notice that future-focused discussions often include comparisons and conditional reasoning. For example, if the US maintains tariffs, Europe may respond with new trade measures which could affect Arctic cooperation. Or, if Greenland continues to attract investment, the region might become more strategically important. And these sentences include cause and effect ideas, comparisons, and modal verbs, which are all very important for expressing complex ideas in English. And practicing them in context helps learners understand both language structure and global issues at the same time.
Another point to keep in mind is that even when discussing the future, journalists, analysts, and diplomats often use neutral language to avoid bias, which is why phrases like is expected to, could result in, or may influence are common, because they show possibilities without making assumptions, and learners should try to notice these phrases in context because they are very common in English news, reports, and podcasts, and understanding them allows learners to read and listen critically, making sense of information while also learning how to discuss sensitive topics in a professional, neutral way.
Yes, and for English learners, it is also helpful to practice summarizing future-focused news, because it encourages active learning. So after reading an article or listening to a podcast segment about US-Europe relations, you can write a short summary in your own words, such as, "The US tariffs may create challenges, but dialogue could help countries cooperate," or "Greenland might become more important for Arctic security if investment continues." And this exercise strengthens comprehension, vocabulary retention, and the ability to express complex ideas in simple English, which is exactly the type of skill learners need to understand international relations and policy discussions in real life.
Another important skill for learners is noticing repeated patterns and linking them to possible outcomes. For example, when multiple reports or experts use words like cooperation, negotiation, and strategic interests, learners can see that even when there is tension, the possibility of dialogue and compromise remains, and by linking vocabulary with context, learners can improve not only their understanding of global news, but also their ability to discuss abstract ideas in English, because international relations often involve multiple layers of cause, effect, and strategy, and recognizing these patterns helps learners make sense of long and complex sentences.
And finally, Adam, learners should remember that practicing English through world events is not only about understanding the news, but also about building confidence, because when you see how words like could, might, and may are used, how conditional sentences are formed, and how cause and effect relationships are explained, you are learning to think in English, express ideas carefully, and discuss international topics with clarity, which is very useful for academic, professional, and everyday conversations. And it shows that English learning can go hand in hand with understanding global affairs.
So, in summary, the future of U.S.-Europe relations and Greenland's strategic role may involve many possibilities, including cooperation, negotiation, and dialogue. And even though tariffs can create challenges, there are tools and approaches that countries can use to manage tension, and by paying attention to modal verbs, conditional sentences, cause and effect language, and future-focused vocabulary, learners can both understand these complex topics and improve their English skills at the same time, which is exactly the goal of this educational podcast.
Yes, Adam. And remember, learners, the future is always full of possibilities. And by practicing English with topics like these, you are not only learning new words and structures, but also gaining confidence to discuss world events clearly, thoughtfully, and professionally. So keep listening, reading, and practicing every day, and you will gradually become more fluent in understanding and explaining complex issues in English, just like we are doing together in this podcast.
All right. In this final section of our podcast, we are going to review everything we have learned together, not only about the topic of U.S. tariffs on Greenland and their possible effects on Europe and global relations, but also about the English language skills that you can practice and use in your own learning, because it is very important to remember that this podcast is created purely for educational purposes, which means we are explaining facts, vocabulary, sentence structures, and comprehension strategies, and we are not giving any personal, political, or financial advice, so listeners should always think critically and consult experts if they want guidance on actual policy or investments, while at the same time using what they hear here to improve English reading, listening, and speaking skills in real-world contexts.
Yes, Adam, and learners, it is very useful to pause and think about the vocabulary we use throughout this podcast, because words like tariff, policy, cooperation, dialogue, negotiation, strategic interests, and modal verbs, such as could, might, and may, appeared many times, and by noticing how these words connect in long sentences, you can practice understanding cause and effect, possibility, and conditional reasoning, which are very common in news reporting, podcasts, and professional discussions. So try to remember not only the meaning of the words, but also the way they are used in full sentences, because this will help you speak and write English more confidently about complex global topics.
Another thing to remember, Julia, is that the sentence structures we practiced are also very important for English learners, because we often used long sentences that connect ideas with words like because, if, which means, and so, and by paying attention to these connectors, listeners can improve both comprehension and speaking, because real-world English, especially in news and educational podcasts, often uses long sentences to explain relationships between ideas, events, and consequences, and learning how to break them into smaller parts will help you understand more clearly, remember vocabulary more easily, and feel more confident when listening or reading.
Exactly, Adam. And another useful skill we focused on in this podcast is active listening. Because when you listen carefully, pause, repeat, and summarize what you heard, you are training your brain to process English in real time. And this practice is very helpful for understanding complex topics like US-Europe relations, Arctic strategy, or trade policies, because it allows you to recognize key words, understand sentence meaning, and notice the differences between headlines, social media opinions, and detailed reports, which is a very important skill not only for English learning, but also for understanding global news critically and thoughtfully.
And it is also important to remember the role of neutrality and careful language, because in this podcast, we have avoided taking sides or making judgments, and this is a useful lesson for learners, because English used in professional and academic settings often values clarity, accuracy, and neutrality. And by listening to how we describe tariffs, Arctic strategy, and international relations without exaggeration or opinion, you can improve your ability to discuss sensitive topics in English politely and effectively, which is a skill that is useful for school, work, and everyday conversations.
Yes, Adam and learners. It is very encouraging to remember that every time you listen to an educational podcast like this, you are not only learning about world events, but also practicing English in a structured, guided way. So even if some sentences seem long or vocabulary seems new, remember that practice will help you gradually understand more, speak more confidently, and feel more comfortable with real-world English. And the most important thing is to keep listening, reading, and speaking every day, because improvement comes from consistency and patience.
Finally, we want to remind all listeners that the content of this podcast is entirely educational and intended to help you improve your English while learning about global topics, and it should not be interpreted as political advice, financial guidance, or any type of recommendation for action. And by keeping this in mind, learners can enjoy the podcast safely, focus on language learning, and understand the topic of Greenland tariffs, U.S. to Europe relations, and Arctic strategy without confusion, while also gaining vocabulary, sentence patterns, and comprehension skills that are useful for many other topics.
And so, learners, as we end this episode, remember to be confident in your English learning journey, to practice using new words and sentence structures every day, and to stay curious about world events, because the more you listen, read, and engage with English content, the stronger your understanding and speaking skills will become. And we hope this podcast has given you not only knowledge about tariffs and international relations, but also the tools to become a more confident English learner, ready to explore new topics, ask questions, and express your thoughts clearly and accurately in English.
That's right, Julia, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us in this educational exploration, for practicing English with us, and for keeping an open and curious mind about world events. And remember that every sentence you hear, every word you learn, and every idea you understand brings you one step closer to fluency. So keep practicing, stay patient, and continue learning with confidence.
Yes, Adam, and from all of us here, we wish you success in your English learning journey, and we hope you will continue to join us in future episodes, listening carefully, practicing actively, and growing not only in English, but also in your understanding of the world. Because learning and curiosity together create confidence, skill, and knowledge that lasts a lifetime.